So yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. It's really, really lovely to have you here this evening. I'm Anna, as you can see. So I coordinate this book club, which is part of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is really all about, is an organization which is all about exploring how to build an economy with people and environment at its core. This month, so we run a monthly or bi-monthly book club, and this month we're experimenting with a slightly different format. So rather than putting a book kind of at the heart of the discussion, we've decided to start with a question. So is capitalism racist? A pretty big question to experiment with, but I think we'll give it our best shot. So it'd be really interesting to hear what you think of that. So as you will have seen, we put a few different resources on the event. So it'll be really interesting to hear who, oh, that's absolutely fine, Mel, don't worry. It'll be really lovely to hear what people have read, or even if it's not any of the resources that we suggested just over the past year or over the course of time, what you have kind of delved into and the ideas that you have. Chloe is joining us. So Chloe's just finished her master's at SOAS in environment, politics, and development. So has a lot more experience or has done a lot more reading than I have, I think, over the course of time, and will be very much helping to facilitate a good conversation. So thanks for joining, Chloe. Do you want to say anything else, Chloe?
No, just hi, and really looking forward to the discussion. And something else as well is obviously you have to acknowledge the bodies you're in, and this is all very much like a new topic, something that I've really just been reading about a lot over the past year in certain circumstances. So yeah, just kind of a continuous process of learning, but would be particularly, if you haven't read the resources, this is all something that we have a personal experience of. So it would be really lovely to hear that. But yeah, that's all, looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, we were just saying before we joined, I think we need to come into this discussion extremely humble and willing to learn, very much appreciating that, I obviously am white and don't have lived experience of this. So I think it will be really good to talk about it and just to hear everybody's voices and not think just about the academic and the reading, but also to hear people's own experiences of people's own experiences and how that has influenced the way that they think and hear those perspectives. So yeah, in terms of the structure of the conversation, so I think we'll do a few introductions and then go over a few key concepts just to try and clarify what we are talking about and what we're not talking about, and then split the conversation really into three. So initially talk about the origins of capitalism and how those origins are linked to racism, and then think about capitalism more in its current form. And then Chloe will be going over a specific example, so community land trusts, which she wrote her dissertation on, and how that's an example of an alternative economic structure being put in place to try and combat some of the issues of capitalism. And she'll do a much better job of articulating that than I just did. But it will be great to get out of the theory, I think, and then to hear some of your own personal experiences or other ideas. So in terms of introductions, it would be really nice just to hear, if you could introduce yourself and really why you wanted to join this conversation to kick us off. So Chloe, I don't know if you would like to start and then pass on to somebody else.
Sure. I think for me, it's just been a year where everyone has learned about this, whether it was very much not through books. And I think it is a really valid year for that reason, also to delve into some of the ideas, because I think there's been a lot going on that could do with, in my opinion, a bit more kind of intellectual delving down. So like, why defund the police? Why, really quite very left-wing ideas that we haven't heard in such a mainstream context before. So I guess for me, yeah, just delving into these ideas a bit more in a space where you feel like it's kind of safe to do that, and yeah, just hear people's different reflections on it, really.
Do you want to pass on to someone, Chloe?
So yeah, David Harmon, hello, and you next.
Hi there. Yes. Well, I think why I'm particularly interested. I'm an independent consultant looking particularly to help SMEs with their sustainability issues. But no, this subject is I find very intriguing because I do feel that the globe is very much split up. That there's the so-called first world developed countries, and I do have a bit of a guilt complex that I'm living a lifestyle that the rest of the world can't enjoy, and it is really down to sort of the capitalist principles that you aiming to produce things as cheaply as possible and maximize your profits as much as you can. And I'm just intrigued to know how we can start addressing this, and whether it's just a thing we've got to live with, or whether it's actually okay, not in much that it's outright racist, but that the cost of living in different parts of the world is different, and we're at liberty to maximize our living through optimizing that position. Let's pass over to Mark. He's next on my list.
Thanks, David. I've been a member of WEAll, I think, just about from when it started, and I'm studying part-time for an AD at Strathclyde Uni, and I've been doing a lot of stuff around kind of epistemological violence and all these kind of things, looking at kind of voices, epistemologies of the South by a guy called Boaventura de Sousa Santos, and getting more and more into kind of indigenous knowledge and things like that. But essentially, I suppose, having not been a fan of capitalism for a long time, but then starting to realise, as we start to kind of look at decolonialising the curriculum, that first of all, that we are still in colonial times, so we're not in a post-colonial world, and colonialism is like that with capitalism. They're the same coin. So if we want to decolonialize the curriculum, we should also decapitalize it. What I've got a meeting you're all invited to, which is on fittingly the 1st of May, where a group of us are getting together to set up a anti-capitalist education website. Because if you haven't seen it, there's a brilliant anti-racist educator website, which I would recommend to everybody. So it kind of makes sense that there's a guy called Eric Olin Wright that some of you might know, who wrote a lot of anti-capitalist stuff. But it's really about trying to bring balance into the education system, rather than have a kind of normative values that are all built around the kind of concept of the market and capitalism. So I will pass to Lan.
Hi, I'm Lan. I'm a student at the University of West of Scotland. I'm just here to learn, as I've never really grappled with what exactly capitalism is and how it arose. So sorry, that's
amazing. Thanks, Lan. Would you like to pass on to somebody else?
To Sonia.
Yes, hello. Okay, let me see if you can see me. So, okay, yes, hi. Okay, well, I'm not sure if I should say good evening. I'm calling from Germany. So, why am I joining this call? Well, since obviously the George Floyd issue I actually came back more active into a group of Afro-Germans, and there was a lot of input over the last year because there have been a lot of online events, so which I was luckily able to join because everything is online. Doing that, you come across the issue of abolitionism at some point of time, of course. And another interesting fact maybe is why I'm a bit critical, or maybe more critical than others. I'm actually born in the GDR back in the days. So I haven't actually been born into the system of capitalism as being the state of art. So in the combination of me being Afro-German, being a bit, having a different view, of course, on different aspects, well, I thought it was a very clear question, as being the title of the event, and I'm very curious to learn more. So because I tend to think from what I have seen and read that it's rather a yes, the answer to the question, due to power structures. So however, but I'm very curious, and I'm, yeah, happy to be here. So I think I have to pass on to somebody. So I would like to pass on to Christina. I'm not sure if I pronounce her right, but hopefully. Thank you.
Yes, yes, you did. So hi, everyone. I'm doing my dissertation, and I'm a criminology student. So I am really interested in how to link capitalism and racism and get a new insight on it, because I think it's really interesting. That's pretty much it. I would like to pass it to Heather. Do I pronounce it right? Sorry if I didn't.
Yes, that's me. I'm Heather Mack. Sorry, I missed the beginning, but I'm guessing we're just introducing ourselves and what we think of the topic. Okay, so I'm Heather Mack. I am one of the co-founders of a group called Diversity in Sustainability. And and I think just in my reflection, I do think that the way that capitalism was set up, if we think all the way back to the British East India Company and some of the organizations that were sent to, colonize other parts of the world, I do think that capitalism is racist just from the way that it was set up. I think there's ways that it's changing now, but at the same time, as I've set up diversity and sustainability, the more I realize each day that it's so inbuilt into the system, and oftentimes we're putting a Band-Aid on a long legacy of colonialism and slavery. So that's my thought. So.
Thanks, Heather. That's great. It's always amazing to get a sense of who's in the room. And I think what is so important about these is that they are very much everybody collectively sharing our knowledge. So we all come away much richer. Mel, did you introduce yourself? Or Stephen?
No, I haven't.
No.
Hi, I'm an educator also. So I'm reading about, I think Mark said it well in terms of decolonizing the curriculum, and also everything that you've been mentioning in terms of protests, George Floyd protests, and also, of course, discussions about military and prison industrial complex, which I've been interested in, of course, have to address capitalism's role in those. And so I'm just here to learn more so that I could, of course, incorporate all my learnings into my practice. Thank you.
Thanks, Mel. That's great. And thanks for joining. Stephen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello. I'm in Galway. I'm originally from London. I think I started reading a lot more Black authors over the last year. I have got mute off, haven't I? Yeah, I was trying to read a lot of stuff. Have been listening to a lot of podcasts, a lot of webinars, and various things in the wake of Black Lives Matter probably should have read a lot more on certain subjects over prior to that, but definitely picked up on Cahinda Andrews, who I see is on your reading list, and maybe the reason why I booked into this, because he was turning up on a lot of webinars I was watching. I thought that book was really good. It's like really clearly explained. Did see there's a backlash webinar thing on, I think like next week or something, trying to put the case against him. I probably spend too much time going through Eventbrite listings to see what's coming up, so I came across that. But I think Cahinda Andrews is really good in like the way he wrote that. I think Angela Saini is really good in the way she wrote. Superior is a really good book if you haven't read it. Trying to think who else. Read Ta-Nehisi Coates recently. Angela Davis is turning up doing a lot of talks over the last while as well, and I need to read a lot more of her. I'm half English, half Kenyan. Parents met in Canada. Split up when I was very young, which has left me with a weird perspective on race and stuff, because I was brought up by a white mother. Yeah, that's me.
No, that's great. Thanks for sharing, Stephen. And also, I mean, I think there's so much to read on this subject, so it'd be great to, if anything has had a particularly big impact on you, if you could share it in the chat, or where relevant, where it comes up in conversation, that would be fantastic. So I think in the interest of time, and also just to facilitate as clear a conversation as possible, given how broad the subject is, Chloe, you were going to take us through a couple of concepts, and like we said, it would be great to hear if you actively disagree or do agree with those concepts, but I think that will help us then move forward to into more to deliberate more specific questions. So Chloe, do you want to go for it? We thought we would just outline primitive accumulation, capitalism itself, neoliberalism, and neocolonialism. So I'll share my screen because we've got a little mural that we've put together.
Lovely. So I'll start off with the big one, capitalism. I think there are literally, as you all know, books and books on this. I think for the purposes of discussion today, we're going very much for an economic system where private actors are allowed to own and control the use of property in accord with their own interests. And the overriding belief in the pricing mechanism that coordinates supply and demand is supposedly in the best interest of society. So the shortest definition, this is in order to separate it from ideas of a political system and from alternatives that there are, such as crony capitalism, as Sonia mentioned, more planned capitalist economies. So pretty much private property and the function of the market will be kind of the bare bones of how we're trying to understand capitalism. Primitive accumulation is a topic which comes up both when describing the origins of capitalism and then neoliberalism, which is seen as both an ideology and a version of the economy that exists in quite a broad sense. So what primitive accumulation is, that's why I thought it would be useful to go over it. Marx came up with this idea. He basically thought the origins of capitalism were not in the Industrial Revolution, but very much when land was enclosed that used to be collectively owned and managed by the English peasantry. So you had common land that with subsistence farmers, but these would be collectively held and managed. And these were closed in and became owned by people. So this was the beginning of private property. This was the beginning of being able to begin capitalist export-orientated farming operations. So we talk about primitive accumulation. Shall I leave the origins of capitalism because we're coming back to that, Anna? Yeah, okay. And then finally, I've kind of already touched on this. Neoliberalism is an ideology and a policy model. This was very influenced by the ideas of an economist called Hayek, and it came around in the 1980s, stimulated by Thatcher and Reagan. And what this really is a huge emphasis on the value of the free market. So whereas capitalism is based in a belief of the market to regulate supply and demand, neoliberalism is this idea that the market should really be in control of everything. Any attempt to limit the market is a limitation on economic freedom. And this is coined or denoted as laissez-faire economics because of a complete step back of the state. Yeah, I think that's where I'm going to leave it and let Anna take on neocolonialism. And apologies for how broad brushstrokes. We were kind of like, let's try and stick some pins in things, but feel free to put questions and thoughts in the chat on extension or disagreements with what I've just said.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate these are all huge concepts we're trying to condense down to one sentence. So neocolonialism, I think from, again, my limited research, is really the use of economic, political, cultural, other methods of control to influence other countries. So especially former colonies is generally the context in which it's used. And there's very much a power imbalance between those who are kind of at the receiving end of neocolonialism and those who are doing the ongoing form of colonizing. So one quote that I particularly liked was, when it functions, the neocolonial system gives the appearance of independence to the neocolony, and it reinforces this image of independence to legitimate the existing power structures that are ongoing. Yeah, so I think briefly before we move on, it would be interesting to hear if anyone has any sort of violent disagreement with that or wants to contribute anything else from their experience. And I think because I'm screen sharing, I can't see the chat, but yeah, David, Mark, that's Mark, yeah.
No, I mean, I think these are really useful, kind of quite tight descriptions. I put a wee element in this is a book by Slavoj Žižek, Trouble in Paradise, and the End of Capitalism, and he talks about a guy called Lazaro. I think it's Nicholas Lazaro, and it talks about the investor of the self, and how these capitalist ideas are internalized. So that you become a kind of investor in your education, an investor in your health, and for me that's one of the most insidious kind of elements, which I think kind of neoliberal capitalism has influenced so people without this consumerism, but this is something like beyond consumerism. is to try to think, you're right, we're all in competition, and the only reason we go and get degrees of education is because we need to get a job, and the whole of life starts to revolve around the economy. So that I'm not sure if that's captured here, because there's a lot of things that that you're trying to cover, but for me that's one of the key toxic elements of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism in particular, is this progressive internalization of these kind of values, and that's obviously, I see education as part of that process, which is kind of why I think education is a really interesting area to challenge capitalist thinking.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Mark. And what I'm actually going to do is share the link so you can join the mural as a visitor. And actually, if you can throw in those thoughts that you have, then that would be absolutely fantastic, so we can capture them. So that's the link now in the chat. Does anyone else want to add anything before we kind of move on to the deeper discussion? No. Okay. Okay, so what we're going to do now is zoom out a little bit and really go into to begin to discuss how are the origins of capitalism racist. So we picked out a couple of the key ideas that came out of the podcast and a couple of the initial readings. Chloe, I don't know if you want to elaborate on them very briefly before we kind of open it up.
Yeah, for sure. So just really try to extract two things that were mentioned in both the video, but largely the podcast. So Vijay Prashad is kind of, if you see those sort of little blobs, kind of all go together. So capitalism didn't begin with the industriousness of the Europeans, but through the violent enclosure of common resources in the third world. So the reason why I gave you a definition for primitive accumulation, so which was the closing off of communal land for communal purposes, social life, material life, was that Vijay Prashad sees this as basically the basis of colonialism. The idea that you can enclose other parts of the world, you can exploit for profit what is there, and other systems which particularly I did undergrad in African history, and particularly different land tenure systems, for example, that were communal, and this whole idea of, well, they didn't get any say at all, it was extracted wealth. So that was his idea that basically the very origins of capitalism are racist. And then he connects this to current third world debt, as does Robin Kelly in the video. So basically this is still linked to slavery and colonialism. Those debts have still not been paid off. That inequality of resources have still not been addressed. So those main two.
Thanks, Chloe. Yeah, and I mean, I then threw in an idea about that came up in Kahindi Andrews' book about genocide being absolutely central to the development of colonization and then resource extraction, moving from the peripheral countries, if you like, or the colonized countries, to now what are the much wealthier Western countries. But yeah, I mean, I'm really curious to throw it out to everybody and hear what your thoughts are. Yeah, on if you think the origins of capitalism are inherently racist, or if they could be maybe inherently exploitative but not necessarily racist, or yeah, or any other kind of relationships that you've observed or read about.
I can talk a little bit about what I've seen in Canada. So I think if we look at how Canada formed as a country, it was you know, the British and the French coming in and essentially taking the land away from Indigenous people. And I think this past year I've been doing a lot of research and just kind of trying to understand the history. And one of the pieces that I found very striking was that prior to North America or Turtle Island being colonized, there's 100 million Indigenous people living on the land. So I think when we think about that, I think that notion of establishing dominance over certain people and just viewing certain people as inferior, I think that notion is racist. And I think just building that system of capitalism on top of that in terms of free land and free labor because of slavery, to me, that pointed to racism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I read one article which was basically arguing that people have always fought one another, and therefore that the capitalism kind of arose out of arose out of people fighting against one another and therefore the strongest group winning, rather than a racial conceptualization of superior and inferior. But yeah, I'm very interested to hear what everybody else has to say. Sonia, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about it. It probably relates to something I saw. The question is basically, when we follow the approach that the roots of capitalism have been there before, the colonies kind of like, got into the picture. The question is then basically, if the colonization didn't happen, so, and I'm speaking basically of any geographic area outside of Europe, would that system be able to be that strong and still existing, or would it not be the case because of lack of resources? Because I think the boost, I mean, that's what I understood from, and it makes sense to me from that documentary, is that the boost of capitalism basically required the resources, and due to finding, well, let's say it like that, these resources, it was able to be so powerful at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody else want to add to that?
Yes, it's it was just this comment on the mural you got about the that capitalism didn't start with the Industrial Revolution, but went back further than that. And I'm just wondering whether the question is a little bit too advanced, and that perhaps we should be asking, is capitalism elitist? Because I sort of think of the example that we probably all know is the French Revolution, where France became a republic, because the aristocracy were just running roughshod over the lower classes, and in a way, that's what is happening. Perhaps why we're asking the question whether capitalism is racist. That capitalism it's very much about imposing your desires, your individual desires, and at the cost of everybody else's. So it's almost immaterial as to the nationality or the race of that person. It's the fact that you're looking at that person as being inferior, and you can take advantage of them, and that is perhaps what is wrong with capitalism, that it does encourage the individual to win and almost win at any cost.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it's something I've been grappling with a little bit. Is there a different relationship between capitalism and race, and capitalism and gender, or capitalism and poverty? And obviously they are all very much interlinked. And something I found interesting in the Kehinde Andrews, The New Age of Empire, was the fact that he claimed that there was quite a different relationship, for example, between race and capitalism and gender and capitalism, in that he said patriarchy could be abolished in a new iteration of Western imperialism, or there could be a patriarchal system in the future which is still racist. So he was also arguing the West is practiced through patriarchy but built on white supremacy. And I'm not entirely sure I've got my head around that, but what I think it's getting at is that the process of extraction and colonization of various different countries was built on this notion of an inferior race, in a way that it wasn't built on the assumption of an inferior gender, because the gender thing was just kind of part and parcel of a lot of different societies, but not necessarily sort of tied up with capitalism itself in the process of colonization. And another thing that I thought was interesting then is that there are many women in the world who very much still benefit from the privilege, well, not benefit from the privilege, but who benefit from the extraction that has gone on as a result of colonization. Yeah, but it would be interesting to hear what your thoughts are on that, because I'm not sure I've got that quite straight in my head.
Yes, well, yes, I think the patriarchy is that thing that, well, I know better than you. Let me help you. You know, that's perhaps the image that's perhaps pictured there. That that the West was trying to bring everybody else up to their standard, but at the same time, taking advantage that perhaps they didn't know any better, or the assumption that they didn't know any better. But the gender thing, again, that's almost a global thing, isn't it? Even in the in UK, for instance, it's still it's not that long ago that women weren't allowed to vote, and that the inheritance line always went through the male the male lineage. So I still think, still coming back to the fact that capitalism, in many ways it does improve life, because it introduces competition, but I think it's still got that element that in order to win, you've got to take advantage, and you therefore view yourself as being elite, and that you're superior to people who you employ, and to a certain extent even to your customers. That's well, it's I forgot his first name, but Rantner, who owned the jewelry store, when he famously at a conference poo-pooed the whole products that he sold, and said that his customers were absolutely crazy to buy them because they were worthless. They weren't worth the money that they paid for them, and as a consequence his business totally collapsed and disappeared. And that was because he had this sort of elitist view that he got this range of products that he was making money on, but he was managing to pull the wool over the eyes of his customers and basically rip them off, and he seemed very happy about that and very proud of it, that he actually wanted to boast about it. But of course, that was his downfall.
Sorry.
No, go, Sonia.
I was just thinking about the gender and capitalism topic. When I look at Europe, I think the gender issue has been there for a very long time. And I also was thinking before that we do know there have been other cultures, like, where there was not so much of inequality or okay, well, you know what I mean. So it was not necessarily led by men. And I don't want to say it has been the case everywhere in Africa, but there have been cultures where there has been much more equality. And with the colonialization, Christianity has been introduced, and that's where the gender issue came with. Basically, it was also at the places where it hasn't been there before. It has been kind of imported into that, because you have also missionaries coming. So the gender and the capitalism is a bit of a different story, because I think the gender issue has been there a long time before the capitalism, at least in Europe.
I think that's I'm not quite sure how I put my hand up. I'm not quite sure where the button is. Is it okay if I go?
Yeah, go, Chloe.
yeah, I think it's a really difficult one. I feel like we're very ambitious talking about like such huge things. It's so important. I think my feeling about gender as well is that it kind of works in different ways. Something that stood out for me from like previous studies and just the video for this week with Robin Kelly was that skin became a part of this. Skin wasn't originally a part of this, and that Robin Kelly talks about at the beginning of racism, talking about the British and the Irish and constructing race. I was very surprised. There used to be signs in Britain which said no dogs, no black people, no Irish. And I didn't realize the construction of race was so extreme around the Irish and themselves. And I think it can help with this. And I guess I see race is different because I think I see it's a construction of inferiority that enabled colonialism to happen, and the neo-colonialism that Mark mentioned that's still going on to be enabled. And I think gender, as Sonia mentioned as well, it functions in different ways. It has its own kind of history and its own, my feeling with gender is that it has its own part in capitalism where there was no acknowledgement for so long, even by Marx, of women underpinning the economy, of women doing the work that produce, making the food, doing a lot of field work as well, that actually makes people be able to go to sleep and get up to go to work. And I think for me that there is a difference with that. But I guess one thing is there, just to like throw a question, like, is anyone got an opinion that like, are the origins of capitalism not racist? Like, do we feel like there's something that we haven't discussed that could say, okay, no? I'd be really interested to hear if anyone, what someone thinks about that.
I'll jump in for a minute. I think what I'm still not entirely clear on, there are probably two things I'm not entirely clear on. One is that, colonization itself, and I appreciate this is me now talking about colonization rather than capitalism, although one, they are very much part and parcel of the same process, is that people were, the Western and European countries, people were racist, and then they colonized other people and extracted a lot of resources. What I am wondering is if they colonized certain places because they saw the people as inferior, or simply because those places were resource rich and at the same time they were racist. So I'm not sure to what extent there is a causal relationship there. That's something I would like to do more reading into. And then someone we haven't yet touched on is Thomas Sowell, who is a very much a free market economist. And I think I've not read a lot of his work, but I think there is an argument using China as an example that actually the process of capitalism has raised billions of people out of poverty. And I think that is fairly well demonstrated. And oh no, Mark's shaking his head. So what I'm curious about is, can capitalism simultaneously be racist and leave a lot of people behind, and yet also bring lots of people out of poverty? I'll hand over to Mark there to push back.
No, thanks. I know. I think it's good to try and have other kind of perspectives, but that is a particular kind of favourite of mine, because like Steven Pinker and people like that have kind of written about these amazing advances and how lucky we are, and how the world's so much more peaceful. Sometimes you've got to just wonder what planet people are on. But with that particular thing about people being raised out of poverty, there's some brilliant stuff by Philip Alston, who was the UN rapporteur, or whatever they call it, on extreme poverty. And he was pointing out the fact that what they're saying is being brought out of poverty is having more than kind of like $2 a day. So everything you've got to question how things are framed in these things. So when they're saying is capitalism's brought all these people out of poverty, the people are still in poverty, right? So that's the first one. Secondly, if you'd had a different system that wasn't capitalism, so say it was cooperatives, mutuals, etc., something which didn't, have huge inequalities of wealth, so grotesquely enriching a very, very small number of people for the little tiny breadcrumbs to kind of fall down to smaller, to a larger number of people to have very little. How that can be claimed to be kind of effective or successful in any way is beyond me, let alone the fact that it completely ignores the environmental cost of, the way it generates, whatever, market growth. So, I mean, this is, it is frustrating the more that I think I kind of got turned on to it by, it was a book, not a very, not radical at all. Will Hutton wrote a book called The World We're In. And there was a piece about the IMF and the World Bank and the kind of economic restructuring, which basically they were saying, open your markets up and don't spend any money on public services, and we'll lend you this money. And obviously, all these big corporations were not paying any tax, destroying the environment. And the IMF's policies were making sure that these countries stayed really poor in absolutely terrible conditions. And then, the same policy goes on decade after decade, and COVID comes along, and so it's genocide essentially. It's officially sanctioned genocide has been done by these organisations which have all these intelligent people sitting around. So it's for me, capitalism is not only racist, it's genocidal, it's femicidal, and it's ecocidal. So it's not got a lot going for itself as far as I'm concerned. And the last thing I'll say is that what we see in capitalism is constantly in crisis. And Grace Blakely wrote a good book, I think it's called Stolen, and about the financialization of the market. And that was particularly around the crash back in 2007, 2008, where they just found a way to generate money which was in complete fantasy, but just grotesquely enriched huge numbers of people, destabilized the market. And then, so it's basically capitalism, socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. But yeah, I'll try not to go on, sorry. But you got me on one of my favorite subjects.
No, it's great. That's why I threw in that that slightly more controversial comment. I'm aware of time, so I think what we had planned is to move into a broader discussion of how capitalism in its current form, more in the present day, is racist. I think we've begun to kind of go into that anyway. So what I suggest is that if anyone has thoughts to share on that, that would be great, or even begin to move into the is this fixable or changeable stage. And then Chloe, perhaps at about past, you could share your thoughts on community land trust. Does that work?
Sounds lovely.
Yeah. So where we got to with how is the way capitalism reproduces itself racist? I mean, there were various different thoughts that came out of the podcast, and Cedric Robinson and D.G. Kelly, I think his name was. Chloe, do you want to do a very brief summary?
Yeah, so two kind of ideas again to talk about here. So borders and development is one way in which capitalism reproduces this racism. So who's doing the low paid dirty work, both inside and out of the borders? So his main comment was that the policing of movement and the existence among and within nation states becomes a key way that resources are held and hoarded by a particular group of people. So both the nation state, the borders between countries, the racist immigration policies that we have for immigration are racist. And this is in order to keep people in certain countries, ideally doing certain jobs, again, no one's actually doing this. It's just a kind of a technocratic way that capitalism works. The other main kind of way is something called social reproduction theory. Basically, how does capitalism reproduce itself? Why do these economic activities keep on existing? And Cedric Robertson, who wrote Black Marxism, basically said, which we've been talking about a lot really, capitalism latches onto existing hierarchies in society. So gender or race, and exploits and exacerbates them and creates new hierarchies. So class is another really important one here. And without this ability, the profit margins of corporations would be seriously undermined. And the social contract was talked about by Charles Mill in the podcast. And this is basically the idea that, sorry, I meant to say that between countries, you got the social reproduction theory, borders and development. Within countries, why do people have very different life experiences if they're of different colors? This is because the social contract, which is the idea that we have a government that we trust to make decisions for us based on the fact that they're going to give us benefits. Charles Mills says this contract was not extended to everybody. So the entitlements of a nation's white members were based on the exclusion, dispossession, and racial exploitation of others. So those are three ways, both within and between countries, that capitalism is fundamentally racist in how it reproduces itself.
Awesome, thanks Chloe for articulating that quite monumental amount of information in not very many words. What are people's thoughts on those ideas? And I mean, more broadly as well, just thinking of examples about how capitalism today is still fundamentally racist in the way that it operates. I feel like lots of cogs are whirring. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, just briefly, I think something which has changed a little bit through COVID, as far as I can see, is that there was a lot more conversation about post-capitalism. Tim Jackson's just kind of written a new book, and whereas a lot of people, I mean, we kind of talked about it, the fact that, you know, we talked about this being sort of anti-capitalism, whatever, being a left-wing idea. But there's an assumption there that of what is left and what is right. Because my argument, and what we're trying to do with the anti-capitalist education, is to argue against capitalism. It's not a binary between saying what's capitalism, what's socialism. It's pointing out the toxic nature of capitalism, and that, you know, there used to be this thing called TINA, there is no alternative, which was, you know, Margaret Thatcher and all these kind of things, and that is the hegemonic state of capitalism. So it's when you start saying, oh, you can't think, and to sum it up, in the UK, the English kind of education authorities has tried to ban anti-capitalist materials from teaching in school. Now, you can't have anything that's more blatantly trying to shut down any kind of critique than you know, just banning it in school, which some people have pointed out. You know, they never even, you know, banned communist stuff in schools during the Cold War. So it's an important time that we start to question that, and I think that's where the WEAll economies and climate change and climate justice are. You know, you cannot discuss those things, I think, without critiquing capitalism and finding that we need to move past it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I mean, something that definitely goes through my mind a lot is at what point do you change capitalism? At what point does capitalism capitalism no longer capitalism in that point, in that stage of transformation? I'm not sure I've quite got the answer there, but even feeding into that, like, should we, when you look at these big corporations' efforts to improve their diversity and inclusion, that's obviously a good thing, but is the fundamental structure of the corporation or of the financial system, if that's still very much exploitative or not addressing previous historical forms of exploitation and extraction, how can you marry those two together? How can you reconcile those two? We began to have a think about, sorry, mouse not doing the right thing, about the extent to which capitalism could be fixable or changeable. And I don't know if anyone has very strong thoughts about how we can begin to move beyond, basically to make improvements starting where we are. Mel or Christina, I don't know if either of you have thoughts on it. Not right now. Okay.
I guess I'm thinking about something like mutual aid as kind of an example of going outside of capitalism, where you're exchanging like services, and it's not necessarily based on something that is offered by a government or a corporation. I guess that's just one example that I could think of right now.
And there was kind of an explosion of that during COVID as well, wasn't there? Which was pretty fascinating, which shows how in times of crisis people get creative and are willing to maybe think more outside the box than normal. No, thanks for sharing that, Mel. Does anyone else want to share any last thoughts before Chloe kind of takes us out of the theory and more into an example? No. Chloe, do you want to, should I stop sharing my screen? And Chloe's going to share a bit more about her dissertation.
I managed to put my notes everywhere. Let me find them. Okay. So let me share my screen. So as Anna mentioned at the beginning, I studied environment, politics and development, and I ended the year very determined to find an example of something that really addressed very structural relations in capitalism and was in the UK. And I'm actually going to set my timer to run through this a bit quicker than I thought, because you guys have such interesting thoughts. So I'm going to explore how one form of organizing on a micro scale both embodies some of the forms of exclusion that we've been talking about, these structural forms, as well as being an example of resistance. So just quickly, can anyone guess where this is? Does anyone hazard a guess?
Liverpool.
Bang on. Yeah, this is in Liverpool. So this is a street in an area of the city called Toxteth, which is in L8. And L8 is actually a really central into Liverpool. Surprisingly, for the extent to which Mark is going to know a lot about this. So basically, Liverpool 8 is one of the most historic areas in the UK in terms of its multiracial community. And the reasons for economic decline in Liverpool are complex, but very largely tied to the decline of the city as a global seaport, the fallout from the post-industrial transition. And so what the both city council and the government were doing, were these regeneration projects. but what they saw as slums, they were trying to remove. So, and the community who were here described this as ethnic and social cleansing. So you had the urban regeneration strategy that nearly bankrupted the Labour government. You had this both under Labour and Conservative governments. But this, particularly in the 1970s, there was a bit of a turning point. There was a ramping up of very repressive police action on communities in the area who were primarily BAME. And this erupted as a kind of an anti-authority result, also in Brixton in the 1980s. And following this point, as you can see from that street, there really was a level of deprivation which, not having lived my whole life in the South, was really shocked that they were literally overrun. It was overrun with rats, cats, whole buildings had fallen away, and people had tried to move, but a lot of people also couldn't move. The council were not giving them a price at all for their home. They were trying to buy them out for about £8,000. And what they really felt were these people who was massive unemployment and disinvestment in the area, felt that they didn't really have an option to leave for those who remained. So why am I talking to you about Toxteth? I wanted to talk to you about why were these people living there? What were their reasons for not being able to leave? And this really largely due to race and class. And linking right back to a Cedric Robinson quote. So to keep this kind of system of hierarchy where some people do the dirty work to keep others sustained, race and class, there's a huge bank of data, which I'm not going to go into too much now, which summarised at the end by the LSE, the connection particularly between race, deprivation and housing. So poor housing conditions, lower economic status, negative impacts on health. Something that really touched me as well. So my dissertation was quite full of accounts of living in the area and things like the impact on children of walking to school every day through huge piles of rubbish. It became a place where fly tipping happened. The postman stopped turning up. And why, again, does this relate back to some of the themes we've been talking about? Private property is right at the core of capitalism. So property is one of the most important vehicles for structuring power relations in our society, particularly something like housing. Those who don't have full property rights are treated, this is Blondin's opinion, with ambivalent suspicion, even hostility. So you think of social renters, you think of occupants, they were occupying a very precarious situation where they couldn't determine their environment, socially and environmentally. So in 2011, the remaining residents, as I say, a lot of people had left, some people couldn't, some people also wouldn't. They decided to set up a community land trust. So a community land trust is a legal entity where a community owns land and has to use the land for the community with little or no profit-making capacity on any land resale. Something else that's very special about them compared to other organizations is that they can separate land from what's on the land. So you can use it for housing, you could use it for businesses. There are loads of different varieties. So community land trusts emerged out of the civil rights movement from African-American laborers who couldn't access land. And so this whole idea is built on common ownership, on common stewardship, on the idea of having a wider community benefit. So these are spread across Europe, spread across the UK, and spread across the States now. So they in Granby Ford Street, this all started in 2011. The way in which all of these happen, if you start reading into community land trust, it's one of these happenstance things in that lots and lots of these fail because, as you can imagine, buying land in the UK for community benefit is very difficult. They've managed now from 2019, there are 250 homes which either the land trust own and manage or the local housing associations have managed to refurbish. So they also have corner shop projects. They've transformed some of the demolished houses into a garden. And one of the most key thing is that there is no possibility that they can be private buyouts. So you can't sell your house for full price under this. Your house would go back to the trust, and the trust would then decide what would happen. And if you're renting, so they've decided, the community have decided what they wanted to do with the specific asset lock. But this means that any rent will always be kept in line with the median earnings of the area. So from that kind of dereliction, they have done, that's my 7 minutes, they have created something incredible. As they say, they had some amazing involvement, which I won't go into here, but I basically just wanted to bring out what this is, which both the kind of the structural relations that relate to capitalism, as well as specifically, so the Black community are actively engaged. They've got men and women Somali groups and the Stephen Biko Housing Association on the board. So there is a board which manages the trust, and there's membership which is open to the entire postcode, so that everyone in the area has power of decision making over how the trust is used. And basically they've been moved, as mentioned previously, from a position of evictability to having a lot more security. And the housing allocation mechanism specifically tries to prioritize people who were previously had to leave the area. So on a micro scale, this is about undoing the enclosure of the commons and showing that this very structural relation in capitalism had a very positive outcome in this situation. And it also shows that the private property itself, how it is a reproduction of these structures of power, how race and class ends up with you at the bottom of the pile in deciding your living environment. And another point is that made by Robin Kelly in the video, that gentrification is a modern form of settler colonialism. So basically gentrification is whereby low-income earners are pushed out of an area in the city in preference of those who are basically more highly earning. And this has been, this CLT was countering less gentrification and more about disinvestment and neglect. But the community land trusts have also been set up in London and other major cities in the world as creating a place for people to live in cities where normally they're being constructed in interest of capital rather than interest of people. Because unfortunately, these regeneration projects tend, although in the UK you have to build a certain number of affordable homes, largely these projects are places where it's difficult for those who were living there before. It's basically not done in their interest. It's difficult for them to be part of that project again. Quite often it doesn't work out. So that was a hugely quick run through, and I hope it made some sense. But basically what I wanted to show was something that really attached onto some very broad themes that we've been talking about. But I also kind of wanted to leave you with the question of how important is this? Is this enough for us to see beginnings of a new economy? This is a small, tiny example. How relevant is this for international racial reproduction that we have in capitalism? So any thoughts about anything that completely wasn't clear? Because I know I've just run through something that might be completely unfamiliar to you. But yeah, love to hear your thoughts on any aspect of this.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chloe. That was a whirlwind, and I think we've probably been slightly overambitious with the subject matter and the timing. So I think normally I try and end absolutely by 9:45. I might let this run a few minutes over if people would like to join, or if you'd like to drop off, that's absolutely fine. But yeah, really curious to hear anybody's thoughts. Mark, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so, sorry, because I've got to go and pick up my wife, so I need to shoot away. But if anyone hasn't heard of radical municipalism and what was called the fearless cities movement, which is now kind of the Cities for Change, and you can check that out. You know, just Google it. But for me, it's like this combination. It's kind of based on the work of Murray Bookchin, and it's about how we kind of established democracy and democratic decision making and the commons and public ownership and how we live together. Because the whole thing about those enclosures, and when Thatcher came in, sort of basically giving away all the kind of council housing and stopping it being away. So that's that book, the new enclosure, which it talks about how this was basically taking public goods into private ownership at a vast scale. And then what happened was people took loans out in the houses, the interest rate went up, they got put out of the houses were bought by rich landlords, and then the rich landlords made fortunes out of charging huge rents, which then had to be paid for by benefits. So I mean, it's basically just theft, but you know, very cleverly constructed. But no, it's been fascinating. It's really nice to meet you all. And as I say, I'd be really interested in kind of like a post-capitalist group or something within the WEAll kind of family, because I think it's, you know, it's the way things are going. So I'm sorry I've got a dash, but it's really nice to meet you all, and hopefully we'll do this again sometime.
Amazing. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for all your contributions. It's been great to have you. Yeah, I don't know if Lan or Sonia, you have any thoughts on Chloe's presentation?
I guess if we're talking about like how to make change and whether these things are too small, I think my way of seeing of how things are scale up is by having a multiplicity of small small projects, and that's how you scale up. There's too often the thinking that you need to scale up by growing one project and making it larger. So it's about making things hyperlocal, and just in my personal experience, it's for various reasons. You know, a lot of this is about empowering people. I mean, yes, there's things you can do about the structure, but in terms of what we can do now is getting people involved in local activity, in community activity, and empowering people that way. And depending on the groups that they are in, there are groups out there that are very hyperlocal, but unlike volunteering for one, so they are very hyperlocal and community based, but at the same time they are combining social outcomes, health outcomes, along with environmental change and changing in behaviorism, and challenging the ideas of capitalism through like for sharing and being more reflective about what we have. And their goals are linked to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a way of linking. So that's something that's happening right now. Whether that will ever make effective change and dismantle the system, because it's not just the capitalist system that's the problem, it's the positive scientific system that makes us think individually. It's the first past the post, the electoral system. There's quite a lot of systems that can be overwhelming, and it's hard to change. You know, it's hard to make some of the changes we talked today in the capitalist system without changing the electoral system. So I guess, yeah, in terms of change today is just getting as much community groups going and facilitated, and the growth growing through there. Like something like the Land Commission, you know, they're trying to make change, like bringing back brown lands, unused land, and making it productive. But it's really hard to even trace down who owns the land. And then once you work out who owns, it's normally like the NHS, which is massive, and trying to chase down so yeah, it's
But I think you make such a good point, Lan, in that it's, you know, first of all, we've tried to limit this conversation to capitalism and race, whereas actually, you know, once you start thinking about all the problems in the world, you're like, well, it's not just capitalism, it's many different structures, and you know, race is just one, it's one form of, not oppression, one you know, one of the various different challenges, or one of the different power structures rather, is probably what I'm trying to say. But also your comment on really making sure it's local and that we all feel empowered to make change, even if it's small, then does build something meaningful together. And I think if anything, we've seen that from the Black Lives Matter movement, from the climate movement, from all of these movements. We are seeing the kind of rise of collective action, which is so exciting. I think given the time, maybe we'll just go around with one kind of concluding comment from everybody. If there's one key takeaway from this conversation, I know it's been very broad and sweeping, but I hope that everybody feels like they've got something out of it. Sonia, I don't know if you'd like to share.
I can go with that. Okay, well, first of all, well, thank you, Anna, and for organizing, and well, thank you very much, Chloe, for that insight, because I have to admit, I don't know a lot about the UK, and I'm actually, it encourages me to see that these things has happened in the past. So that is, it's I just didn't know that. So I find it extremely encouraging. And apart from that, it was extremely interesting. Yes, it was a great topic, but just kind of picking on different aspects already helps a lot to learn and gain. And obviously we had a lot of people in the round today which have a lot of knowledge, so that was well, extremely encouraging, and I thought it was inspiring, and it was extremely interesting, and so thank you all for that. And yes, if you want to continue, I would be happy to join again. So just to pick up Mark's thought from earlier.
Amazing. Christina, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Anna and Chloe. It was really insightful, and I really liked it. And I do see how you can apply this in Hungary, because in Hungary, everything is more radical than, let's say, in England or in the US, because we don't really have an issue with race, because like mainly there are just white people. So everyone is more inferior than the others. And Hungary is a post-communist country. So we do have this duality, because in people's mind, we still this communist country, but on the outside, we are like pretending to be a capitalist. But thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Stephen? You're on mute, Stephen.
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting. Not sure if I've got takeaway thoughts, just hoping that I was wondering, like, after having read Kanda Andrew's book, if I should just be totally depressed. I saw an interview with him a couple of weeks ago, like where he was talking about revolution as being the next point after the end of New Age of Empire, which was in a book earlier that he published a couple of years earlier, and I hadn't put the two together until I saw him do this talk a couple of weeks ago. If people can get themselves together to have a revolution and maybe make things a lot more egalitarian, it would probably be far more healthy. Trying to see some silver linings in some near calamitous things that I think are happening at the moment. If like Brexit goes as disastrously as like it looks like it may well do, it might mean that certain elements of the political spectrum are no longer going to be present, and you can hopefully have a more egalitarian society. The recent report just seems to be farcical. capitalism did seem to like invent race, so it has been something that's come up in a few things that I've been listening to recently, like the whole 1619 creation of blacks as slaves, which wasn't there at the beginning of that project, and did suddenly come down on people like who were, I heard something about like some black indentured servants a couple of weeks ago from the middle of the 17th century who had the legislation passed around them that that they were slaves for life now, instead of being able to like buy themselves out or have whatever money they owed paid out by the end of the 7 years, which is like what all the Irish indentured servants were doing. So yeah, like the whole idea, there was whites had been thought of as Christians until they, at the time anyway, despite the fact that like there's a older Christian tradition in like in Africa than there was in Europe. Sorry,
no, it's great, and it's been amazing to have all your comments in the chat. I'm sorry that we haven't kind of picked up on them, but I've definitely been enjoying them, so I'm sure other people have been as well. But no, it's been great to have such a wide range of insights. I think this evening is one of the amazing things of going online. We used to meet in person, is actually having a much more international crowd, which is just, it brings such different opinions. So yeah, it's amazing having people dialing in from Canada, from America, from Hungary. Yeah.
This is also something that may lead to something far more egalitarian. I don't know if this is going to sustain after like the end of the pandemic. Like the idea that like people from all over the world can meet in a virtual space and discuss has led to a lot more understanding of people from different areas. I'm not sure how widespread that is, if I've only been in the Zoom meetings that I've been in. So I don't.
No, it's such a good point. And I think it's been the same with, certain international conferences, that suddenly people from all over the world have been able to dial in. Yeah, I mean, in terms of my key takeaway, to be honest, I think it's just so nice to hear and learn from you, and I think it's motivated me to read more, as is often the case. But yeah, thank you for sharing, everyone. Chloe, do you want to just do a last thought?
Yeah, just thank you. Such like a rich discussion. Two real takeaways from me. One from both Christina and Sonia, and just the whole idea of growing up in under communist capitalism, I think is really interesting, and is something, and particularly in somewhere like today's America, where socialism has just become so completely, in the whole world of communism is being locked up, like back in the Cold War. So I think that's something I want to do more reading about. And then I think also Mark's point on education as a really interesting window into all of this. I don't think I'd really thought much about how the British education system has so many faults, but never really thought about it in terms of it being very pro-capitalist rather than anti-capitalist, and in doing so, definitely my education wasn't encouraging us to think about racism either. So those are my two takeaways.
Amazing. Well, look, thanks everybody, and thanks for sticking with us beyond the technical finishing time. So I've put some links in the chat, so if you'd like to keep in touch with the book club, then we have a WhatsApp group and Twitter. You can follow WEAll Read, and that's the best way to kind of keep in the loop with us. So it would be absolutely lovely to see you again. And yeah, we've started meeting every 2 months rather than every 1 month, I think, just to help people get through the books, essentially. But yeah, thanks so much. And I'll send out the recording and potentially the mural and some notes. There's been a couple of requests for your dissertation, Chloe, so we might try and whack that in there as well. But yeah, enjoy the rest of your evening, and thanks so much for joining, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.